What's up, guys? It's me, Coach Mills here, coming at you with a brand new birthday video. And we're doing the heavily requested target priority guide, so you know exactly what characters to focus when and where in any given fight. But do me a solid and come check me out on stream right now in the description down below, and let's jump into the video. Now, we're gonna break this up into separate categories: tanks, DPS, and supports, primarily breaking down who you should focus and at what stage of any given team fight. So let's talk about tanks first. When are you supposed to focus a tank? Now, whether you're a DPS, a tank, or a support, the majority of the time, you're not supposed to hard focus tanks because it's just overall going to be a waste of time. Having two supports pump healing into a tank means that you're going to waste all your time, all your attention, all your firepower farming up a tank that gets healed instantaneous, and you're going to be generating 30% less ult charge. Now, that can change if the tank is incredibly low in health and possible for you to burst down. If there is large amounts of focus fire, think a Discord plus like 3 people shooting at the same tank, or most importantly, if the tank is super out of position. If there's a Reinhardt in your backline, super out of line of sight of his team, then of course, doesn't matter who you are, tank, support, DPS, you should be shooting that tank. Now, this doesn't mean that you could never poke at tanks, but typically you want to be exchanging resources, not exchanging health. Keep in mind that from a damage to healing ratio, healing is going to rise up a tank so quickly, and with all the damage mitigation, you're going to lose that exchange 1 for 1, and they're going to generate support ults very, very quickly at a much faster rate than you are generating it by dealing damage because of that 30% less, and it just charges much less quickly. But if you're trying to poke down tank's resources, for instance, poke a tank so they use DM, poke a Rhine shield so that your Sigma can break and win the shield battle, and you're trying to deny the Rhine space. These could be some examples of when it actually is okay to poke at a tank's resources, but it's much more about the resources themselves, so that's easier for you to deny, hit abilities on them, and things like that. Now, one thing that you need to consider as a tank player up against the tank matchup: if there's a huge effective range disparity between you and the person you're fighting, then you can still poke at them, even if it's not optimal. So normally, I would say even as a tank, tanks focus the other tanks way too much because they're going to generate less ult charge, their damage is less impactful. But if you're a Reinhardt, for instance, in your effective range on top of a diva, then swing away, because the exchange in resources is going to heavily favor you, just because that tank doesn't want to be right on top of you. Another example we could see is like a Reinhardt swinging at a Sigma, or maybe a Sigma poking at distance from a Rhine. While they don't necessarily want to hyper-focus the Rhine, it's okay if that's the only person you can poke at. As long as that Rhine isn't in his effective range onto you, he's basically useless. And while it's not perfect target priority, you can afford to have a much longer fight because your opponent's doing less than you, which is like 0, while you're doing actually something because you're maintaining your effective range. Now let's talk about focusing DPS. Who on the DPS roster should you be focusing, when you should be focusing DPS, and why? Well, the biggest thing that you're doing when you're focusing a DPS is you are denying them opportunity. And this is one of the most important concepts that you need to learn from this video, and it's when a Cassidy goes on an off angle, or peeks the high ground, or gets an aggressive flank off, damage will deny them from that play. It will force them to leave and go back and basically limit their possibility. The longer that person gets to be exposed on that angle, the more at risk your team is. And it's not just any specific role that can deny this. Everyone can deny this: DPS, support, and tank. And this is one of the reasons why there's such a huge disparity as you climb up the ranks. And when you play in high rank versus some of the lower ranks, the amount of time that you have is much different. So if you're a Cassidy peeking out, oftentimes you'll peek out, you'll get 1 or 2 shots off, and an Honor will shoot you. A freaking random amount of damage from a tank will come out. A Fire Strike will come out. A Cassidy will shoot you in the body, or whatever the case may be. You're gonna take damage. The second you expose yourself, you only have a very short window of time before there's a response, and the lower in rank you go, the longer and longer that window is before there is a response. And that's really the difference. That's why DPS smurfs, even if they don't have amazing mechanical skill, much better mechanics, much better anything, because there's not a big enough response and they know how to utilize that window, they are going to be farming. And this is really how you deny. You need to understand that oftentimes it's not about the kill, it's about denial of value. Of course, getting a kill is fantastic, but a Hanzo on an off angle or a Hanzo being allowed to shoot 5-10 times as long as another Hanzo is gonna get that much percentage of value more. So it's really important that you understand this concept. Now, another thing that's really important to force is cooldowns, and this is a really important target priority, especially when you're playing up against the dive. Doesn't really matter what character you're playing or what role you're playing. Once again, it matters that you're forcing out their cooldowns that will deny aggression. So as an example, if you focus a Genji and he uses his deflect early, he's not going to be able to engage until he gets his deflect back, or when he does engage, it's much easier to deal with him in that moment because he doesn't have deflect, and it's more likely that you're going to deny him from getting any value. Just like with the Tracer, oftentimes a Tracer comes in, your goal is to force out as many cooldowns as possible and force that Tracer to recall, not necessarily force recall, force cooldowns, and then chase the Tracer around the map. You're not trying to necessarily kill this person, you're trying to deny them value. That's what it's all about up against DPS, is deny. You're not necessarily trying to outright kill the Pharah, you're trying to make it so if she exists anywhere in a range or space that can really punish your team, she gets hurt from that and she has to play either super passively, or if she doesn't, then she will die. But it's not the death that matters necessarily, it's more about denial of value. And we know this because we've often gone up against a Pharah Mercy, or we played a Pharah Mercy on our team, and it felt like the Pharah Mercy didn't get enough value to justify those 2 slots. Most of the time it comes from the Pharah getting denied of value and then never being able to be aggressive enough to actually go for something. If they try to force it and die, then you'll typically see a swap. So this is the goal, this is the idea, and like I said, any single person can deny. Every single role can deny. Now, some characters are going to be able to do it better, of course, depending on what character they're up against. For instance, characters like Cassidy and characters like Hanzo with a large amount of burst damage are going to be able to force cooldowns from a Tracer faster, and they're typically going to be able to get those characters away quicker. But it doesn't mean that getting shot by an Ana, getting hit by a Kiriko, getting flailed by a Brig so that they have to stay in the fight longer and they have to use more cooldowns isn't effective. All of these things are effective, and it's important to understand that the goal with DPS the majority of the time is that denial. But that still doesn't mean that you can't dive a DPS. It still doesn't mean that you can't go after and punish a DPS. And most of the time, this is from dive compositions where they want to specifically shut down the target. So oftentimes, if you're playing a dive, it is correct for you to jump the actual DPS and not necessarily the supports, especially if a support has a lot of mobility. Diving a Kiriko, pretty hard to do and not typically that efficient. But if you dive like a Hanzo, not only do you put the supports in a weird situation where they have to bail out the Hanzo at the risk of their positioning, which could get them all killed, but, and this is the most important thing, the Hanzo is going to be under more pressure and hopefully killed because he's forced and targeted. So not only does he get removed from the battlefield, but he has less of a window to actually interrupt the engage. Because the worst thing that could happen to you is you go in, let's say you Tracer, Genji, Winston, jump an Ana, and while you're doing that, the Hanzo dinks your Tracer. And then while you're trying to clean up, the Hanzo body shots and storm arrows your Winston. So because this guy was left uncontested, he had a really long amount of time to interrupt the fight. And this is another thing about denial, right? It's the same concept, just in a more aggressive way, to the idea that you need to deny the enemies from peeking certain areas and occupying certain areas that they could be effective. Just like you target one of these characters in a dive, the idea is to shorten the window of time that this DPS could be effective, because the longer they're allowed to exist and be in line of sight of your team, the more they could have an impact over the fight, and you would much rather put it on the supports to have that window. And it's your job, by the way, as someone that is being targeted, whether you're a support or a damage dealer, that you're trying to interrupt and respond. Think about it this way. If you're an Ana and your Hanzo gets dove, your Hanzo was dove because they don't respect the value that you could bring, and it's your responsibility to do something because you were specifically not targeted. In the same way that if the Ana's dove and your Hanzo, it's your job to do something because you were specifically not targeted. It's your job to respond to these targets, because if they are not focusing you and you don't do anything about it, then your teammate is getting shut down, and you are not leveraging the fact that you have a certain longer window of time to interact with them than your teammate does. And this is really important from a defensive point of view and really important for you to understand. I know we're getting into some more advanced concepts here, but if you have any questions, definitely let me know on stream and the links down below. Now, last but certainly not least, the supports, which is kind of like the bread and butter, the caviar, the fucking golden egg that you're trying to go for. Whether you're a tank, a DPS, or even a support, most of the time you want to get a pick on a support at all possible. And of course, these are the characters that you really want to shut down because the lack of sustain is going to allow you to win an elongated fight. And typically, it's going to allow you to win a fight very quickly if you can get support kills. But they're harder to get than others, primarily because of their passive positioning and the fact that they don't have to be going for anything nearly as much as DPS or tanks. They don't have to be taking space in the same way. They get to be protected somewhat. So all in all, supports are harder than other characters to focus and shoot at. Now, especially if supports are in a decent position and together. So let's say an Ana and Brig are sitting next to each other, a Kiriko, Zen are sitting next to each other. These characters are really hard to deal with. You can't commit to them. It's hard to poke them over any long period of time. Unless you have burst, you're not going to be able to realistically kill two supports that are together unless maybe you have like a 3 or 4 man dive going all together. But this is the thing that you need to understand, is that there's a cost to supports playing passive like this. If they're playing in a super passive optimal position, then they are not able to have any aggressive impact over the fight, at least not at a large rate, because of their passive positioning. They're going to be doing less damage potentially. They're going to have less impactful ability use. And this means that you don't necessarily have to hard focus the supports. Denial of the DPS, looking to punish them, and making sure that the supports have to find ways to impact and help their team is a way to get them to slip up, because the most important thing about finding an opportunity to punish a support is taking note of their cooldowns. This is what it's really all about, because supports, when an Ana has a nade and a sleep, and a Kiriko has a Suzu and a teleport, a Lucio has a boop and an amp up, all of these characters are very, very, very hard to punish, if at all, if they're in a good position, if they have their cooldowns. But as a fight plays out, as you deny the value that a DPS is getting, as you make sure that the tank is not necessarily effective playing in your optimal range, and as you bait out cooldowns as the fight progresses, there's going to be more and more windows where you can actually punish. And I want your punishing, if you're ever going aggressive on a support with good positioning, especially if they're playing together with other people, you need to know what cooldowns they have. And there needs to be a reason for you to go after them. You don't want to just be diving an Ana that's next to a Brig if that Ana has all her cooldowns. But perhaps if she has no nade, no sleep, then it actually makes sense for you to be aggressive with them. And I also want to make it clear that just because you're not a DPS, supports and tanks can punish supports all the same as DPS can. Maybe not the same tools in their arsenal, but a diva flying at an isolated support or support that's at a position low cooldowns can kill them very, very quickly. Just like how if you're an Ana, you can nade the enemy Ana and shoot her and basically kill her if she has any other damage onto her, plus she can't bail herself out with self-nade. So there's a lot of ways from pretty much every role and every character to interact and find value up against these characters. But it's kind of interesting how tanks are aggressively positioned, but you're not supposed to focus them. DPS are typically aggressively positioned and you're supposed to deny them. And supports are defensively positioned, but you're supposed to punish them only when they don't have cooldowns though. But anyways, this is a general target priority guide. I could definitely go into more detail if I talk about specific roles and specific characters, which we plan to make in the foreseeable future. So smash that like and subscribe if you want to see that. And check me out on stream right now. Your boy is 26. I know I'm getting a little bit old, but, you know, come check me out. And thank you so much for coming by. I'll see you next time.